Hi, I'm Rob Spall.
And I'm Britt Garner.
Welcome to Nature Insight.
Speed dating with the future. This is where we have the chance to offer you an inside look at the intersection of the science and policy of biodiversity, with unique perspectives from those on the front lines of research and action for nature.
In the first episode of this season, we explored the importance and the tremendous value of genetic diversity. The idea that the greater the differences are in the DNA of a population, the greater the chances are of them surviving and thriving. Literally, strength through diversity.
Yes, and it's also clear that the health of any species is directly related to its environment, from the climate to the health of the soil to sources of food. The interplay of these factors is vital, and when one is stressed, it can have cascading effects on the others. So understanding those interlinkages is vital for biodiversity.
The problem is that understanding how actions on one challenge might affect other challenges at the same time is tremendously complex. For the last 3 years, IPBES has been involved in one of the most ambitious scientific assessments ever undertaken, doing exactly that. The Nexus Assessment looks at how our global crises in biodiversity and water, in food, health, and climate change are really all interconnected, and how important it is to act in ways that address more than just one piece of the puzzle at the same time.
Absolutely. I think about even something like population or community ecology, where you see with certain changes in one population on the landscape or waterscape, you have unintended consequences somewhere else, and then that has unintended consequences within the environment, and that's only in a single habitat. I can't imagine thinking about this globally. My question to you, Rob, is where do you even start with a piece of work like this? It feels almost too big to get your head around.
Well, I think the starting point in terms of the content of an assessment like this is it needs to look at what sorts of trade-offs you have to consider between these different interactions. So if you make a choice in health, is there a trade-off that you're going to necessarily have to accept in biodiversity, in water, in food, in climate change? And you try and, with the best intentions in the world, improve the problem that you're most aware of, and yet you somehow end up making things worse in some of these other areas as well. But also, what kinds of opportunities you could be taking, perhaps on one challenge that might also have great co-benefits in some of these other areas as well. So can you do something about climate change that's also going to be positive for water availability, for food security, and for biodiversity?
This is the dream. Welcome, friends. We are going forth, unafraid, into the Nexus, post-Nexus. Well, when does this report come out?
So by the time this episode airs, the Nexus report will be just about to launch, which is expected to be in early December. I think to understand the Nexus more fully, we really do need to hear from some of the people who've been part of doing this assessment, writing this report. So I've turned to not one, but two special guests for this episode. Dr. Pam McElwee is a professor of human ecology at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and Paula Harrison is the principal natural capital scientist at the Center for Ecology and Hydrology in the United Kingdom. And they're both co-chairs of the IPBES Nexus Assessment.
Excellent.
So I started by asking Paula to explain to me, in really the simplest terms, what is the Nexus?
So if you think of the orchestra as the nexus, then the sections in the orchestra, so your strings, your brass, your percussion, your woodwind, as your elements or your parts of your nexus. And then you can imagine, okay, each of those parts plays in silos without any regard for the rest of the orchestra, and you imagine the musical experience that you get from that. But then if they work together and understand the knowledge and way of playing from those other parts of the orchestra, you get a much more cohesive and harmonious musical experience. Rather than us trying to work towards a harmonious musical experience, we're actually looking at how we view that nexus lens through key environmental social challenges related to biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change.
So in the same way that if you have one instrument and you're trying to tune it in isolation, it might sound fine by itself, or you might think it sounds fine, but it's only when you try and play it with other instruments. And in this case, if you try and address different types of crises together, that you start to realize some of the unintended consequences.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's that acting collectively and inclusively that's really important here. So actually understanding the linkages between the different parts of the system enables you to act on it in a way that benefits more of the system than if you're not aware of those interlinkages.
Okay, so most of us, I think, probably understand some of the challenges that we face with regards to water, to food, and to health. We might even have some insights into the crises in biodiversity and climate change. But I don't think we often think about these links between 2 or 3 of these challenges, let alone 5 of them at once. Pam, why is it important to do that? Why is it important from a policy perspective to think about these interlinkages in policy?
Yeah, let me give an example that was in the news here in the US because it was a really interesting example of these interconnections. So I'm here in the Northeast of the United States, and we have had a devastating impact from the loss of our bat populations due to white nose syndrome, which is a fungus which attacks bats, and it causes the loss of up to 90% of the population. And an economist recently looked at the county level here in the United States where bats had declined the most. And he saw that farmers had increased their pesticide use. It was about by 30% or so to make up for the loss of these bats, because we know that bats eat insects. They're really important predators for a lot of pests that farmers were worried about. So they had to replace the bats in some ways with pesticide use. And the next connection, which nobody had seen until this economist really looked at the data, was that infant mortality in those counties where pesticide use had gone up had increased by 8%. And we know that's a case because pesticides often get in the water supply and they could cross the placental barrier. And so that was over 1,000 infant deaths just in the United States in this Northeast area from the loss of those bats. So we have a biodiversity link, we have a food link, we have a water link, we have a health link, and it's expected that climate change is going to make that white nose syndrome spread even farther.
So doing something in one of these areas of the nexus with the best intentions in the world might be either good or bad unintentionally for some of the other nexus elements then.
Exactly. I'm sure that farmers weren't thinking about infant mortality rates when they increased their pesticide use, but that was the inadvertent outcome of that situation.
We know that the Nexus report is expected to be launched in December, and although we're recording this podcast episode at the end of October, we're not allowed to give away any of the findings yet. But Paula, is it fair to assume that at least part of the report will talk about communities and groups of people who might be more negatively affected by parts of the Nexus, and perhaps some who might be benefiting more than others?
Yes, so the report will include an analysis of past and current trends in the interactions across the nexus. And it's clear from all the evidence that's already out there that there will be winners and losers. For example, we know that food production has increased globally significantly over the past decades, but that has been done really at the cost of sort of water, air, and soil quality through a lot of use of agrochemicals and pesticides. It's also led to significant biodiversity loss, and it's contributed to climate change through greenhouse gas emissions. And even though we have sort of seen positive trends in health, that increase in food production affects different groups of people in different ways. So in some countries, we're seeing sort of overconsumption and simplified diets that are leading to obesity and related health problems, where in other parts of the world, we're still seeing increases in hunger. And we sort of see the negative trends are probably more likely to be affecting sort of those populations in lower and middle income countries, but also those that are marginalized in higher income countries and indigenous peoples.
How about nature itself? Is it fair to say or fair to assume that biodiversity tends to be the loser when decisions are made in other parts of the nexus?
Absolutely. In most of the studies, we see biodiversity is a loser. And I think that's also because a lot of these other sectors that we're considering as part of our nexus don't really consider biodiversity or value it in their decision making, and also are focused really on short-term benefits rather than understanding long-term sustainability. And yet we sort of know that biodiversity is so crucial at underpinning our longer term sustainability. And it's sort of really crucial for the food we eat, clean water that we drink, our overall health and well-being, and actually our overall wider economy.
Pam, what about future trends and future interactions?
Yeah, we take a very comprehensive look at a lot of different possibilities. And so we're calling these response options, but they're essentially policies and actions on the ground that different people can take, whether it's official decision makers and governments or sub-regional governments, cities, communities, individuals, farmers, consumers. So we've got these sort of broad categories we're looking at, and some really tangible examples include things like how do we produce food more sustainably by restoring, for example, soil health. Soil is absolutely fundamental. Soil biodiversity is often overlooked in farmer decision making. But if we look at the soil level, we know that that's going to have a major impact on a farmer's ability to reduce their amount of external chemical inputs. Better soil health also contributes to mitigating climate change because soil can store a great deal of carbon. On the health side, there's been a really interesting move in recent years towards doctors doing things like prescribing nature, getting them out in nature. It gets them physical exercise, often gets them mental health benefits. And it turns out when you have people who are more connected with nature, they're more interested in conserving it. So again, it's a sort of linkage between health and biodiversity. And when you have more green space, you get more trees. Trees contribute to mitigating climate change by absorbing carbon dioxide. So it's a win-win-win.
The economy isn't one of the 5 Nexus elements, but it would seem to me that it has to be a massive consideration when you're taking decisions in any of these areas. I mean, I could imagine response options like the ones you talked about that could be excellent and really positive, but it would be very costly to economies. Is this something that's addressed at all in the work that you've done?
Yeah, we have an entire chapter on economic and financial response options. And one of the things we make clear throughout the report is that continuing on business as usual is enormously costly. So we have costs in terms of climate change impacts, which are increasing every year and are on the order of hundreds of billions of dollars. We have health-related impacts from obesity and production of unhealthy foods. We have costs to biodiversity. I was speaking earlier of the example of losing bat populations. There was a direct cost to farmers of $25 billion from having lost bats that were catching pests for them. So not doing anything is costly. In fact, its response options are going to save us money by helping to reduce some of these risks of economic impacts. But our economics chapter also points out that the financial system is a major driver of these siloed approaches as well, because it tends to fund things that might give a certain rate of return, but not think about the larger externalities, right? And externalities is just a fancy word for saying those risks that are passed on to somebody else. So farmers, for example, that are using pesticides, in my bat example again, they've sort of passed the cost of using those pesticides onto mothers who are experiencing those increased infant mortality rates.
In order to create a report that is going to speak directly to decision makers in each of these areas, in health, in food, in water, in biodiversity, in climate change, you must have had to bring in inputs from incredibly large numbers of fields of work to make it relevant to each of these areas. What kinds of contributions to the Nexus assessment have been particularly important during the process?
Well, we really approached this in an interdisciplinary manner. And so we had chapter teams that were composed of social and natural scientists, humanities in some cases. And one source that was particularly helpful was our engagement with Indigenous and local knowledge, because a lot of Indigenous communities worldwide, even though they don't have a term that relates exactly to Nexus, it's really their worldview. They don't divide things into silos of biodiversity is here, water is over there. It's all part of living holistically and engaging with Mother Earth. And so one that was particularly relevant and interesting, I thought, was when we went to Thailand. And we worked really closely with some local NGOs in northern Thailand that are associated with different indigenous communities, in particular the Karen indigenous community. we were able to visit some farms and look at how that holistic worldview was playing out in practice, the integration of different crops together within a field, the way that crops were conserving soil cover, the way that they were increasing water filtration, the way that they were low carbon and not contributing to climate change because they were integrating trees as well as crops into their fields. It was a great experience, and our host there was Dr. Prasirt Chanakastafan, who is the executive director of the Association for Sustainable Development of the Karen community there.
It's not need to use any chemical pesticide, but naturally through this ritual process. The people believe and they always success.
He's a perfect example of kind of the nexus in his own life because he's a PhD scientist who works at Chiang Mai University, but he's also an indigenous Karen tribal member. And so he's able to bring those two worldviews together. And that's the sort of interdisciplinary, multiple worldview engagement that we tried to have throughout the entire assessment.
So with all this work that you've done for 3 years and having looked at scenarios that you mentioned were somewhat depressive and some that weren't quite so depressive or more positive, optimistic or pessimistic about the feasibility of addressing these nexus elements together into the future? What does the future look like with the benefit of 3 years of work in view?
Personally, I have to have hope. I don't think we would work in this area if you don't have some hope that at some point by the types of assessments that we're doing, we can sort of raise that awareness of that there is urgency to act here. So I'm realistic about the challenges ahead, but also there is optimism there that particularly after the 3 years of work and all the conversations we've had, we know all those conversations need to carry on and need to intensify so that there is greater awareness out there and recognition of the need to act urgently.
Well, for me, I've just been to the Conference of the Parties on the Convention on Biological Diversity, which meets every 2 years, and they are trying to put in place country-level responses to the new global biodiversity framework. These are these new targets that were decided in 2022. And so I would love to see in 2 years' time, when the next CBD meeting is, that those national biodiversity strategic action plans talk about the nexus. And they're not just about biodiversity, but they talk about how biodiversity is interconnected to water, food, climate, and health. And just that understanding that we can't continue to treat these as separate crises. It's all part of one big problem that needs to be tackled together.
You know how much I love a good meta commentary, and I will say it was super cool to hear Pam's description of her host, that executive director for sustainable development in the community in northern Thailand, as being, a nexus in his own life. So I do wonder, while something like an assessment is incredible to have for larger groups, governing bodies, etc., maybe there's also something to be doing personally, each one of us every day.
One of the big parts of every assessment that IPBES does is to try and help find the role for each person, each community, try and find the agency that exists so that people can find themselves in these big problems, but also in the opportunities that exist to actually address them and to solve some of these. Now, in the case of the Nexus Assessment, one of the great things about this report is it's also going to offer a roadmap for different types of actors, different types of groups of people, different types of communities. So a roadmap to try and say, how do we get from where we are now to a more nexus-like approach to these issues?
That is awesome. And, you asked them about being optimistic, pessimistic. For me, that's such a core piece of optimism, knowing that tools like these are going to exist and are coming soon and that so many people have come together to make this happen. Now, the idea of having these tools and using them with different problems in, a nexus approach still, I will admit, sounds a bit abstract. And I do believe you were able to speak to someone who's going to give us much more concrete examples, yes?
I am indeed. Our next guest is going to help make all of this real. The example that he's going to talk about involves a disease that's prevalent in quite a few parts of the developing world particularly, although it also occurs in the developed world, and it's particularly prevalent in parts of southern Africa, where I'm from. It's called bilharzia, but it's also known as schistosomiasis. And I think, Britt, you're a bit familiar with it as well. Perhaps you could tell us a bit about what you know.
Yes, familiar from a very different approach. Just having studied ancient DNA techniques, there are people who have used those same techniques to find out what exactly is on and in mummies and other human remains. And they found incredible amounts of parasites. And this is one of them. They found really, really high prevalence across mummified specimens from ancient Egypt. So this thing has been around for such a long time.
Not only has it been around, it even had a name of its own. And I believe during the Napoleonic Wars, when Napoleon's armies were deciding which routes they were going to take, they were warned against traveling through Egypt in case they were to incur the mummy's curse or the pharaoh's curse. They made the decision to go into Egypt anyway.
You know, like you do.
And the result was they were struck by what at the time was considered to be male menstruation. There was blood in urine, and they didn't know why. And it turns out it was the curse of the pharaohs, or actually schistosomiasis. But this is not just an ancient problem. In modern times, it remains one of the most problematic diseases faced by people around the world. And in fact, up to 800,000 people die each year because of schistosomiasis. One project that's aimed at fighting this disease really illustrates the nexus in action. It's been led by Dr. Jason Rohr from the University of Notre Dame in the United States, but the work itself has been taking place in West Africa, in the Senegal River Basin. So Jason told us a bit more about the challenge of schistosomiasis.
It's the second most devastating and widespread parasitic disease in the world behind malaria. It is a worm that is transmitted from snails to humans, and so when humans, predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa, enter water bodies, the worm penetrates their skin to infect them. And unfortunately, only about a third of the eggs ever leave the human, and 2/3 are left in the body and elicit an immune response and scar tissue around those eggs. And as that scar tissue builds up, the organs, such as the liver and other internal organs in the body, don't function as well, and it can eventually even lead to death.
What does it look like? What does someone who is infected with the disease present with?
Many people around the world have probably seen images of children in Africa with swollen bellies. And there are two causes of that. One of them is kwashiorkor, which is associated with malnutrition. And the second cause is schistosomiasis.
The area of the world which I'm from, Southern Africa, is clearly one of the places where this is a serious problem and a significant public health challenge. And it is something which is an ongoing challenge, right? I mean, it's something that we've tried to address in many different ways, but it keeps coming back again.
Yes, that's correct. There is a drug that can treat the infections. It's called praziquantel. The problem is that as soon as humans return to water bodies with infected snails, they get reinfected. So in the villages that we work with in the Saint Louis and Richard Toll region of Senegal, we'll go back about a year after we provide them the drugs, and prevalence in school children will often be between 70 and 90% for Schistosoma hematobium.
So clearly, it's a massive challenge. Now, earlier in this episode of the podcast, we were listening to the co-chairs of the new IPBES Nexus Report, and they were talking about the importance of tackling major challenges, particularly environmental challenges, together. So you're leading a project which does exactly this. Can you give us a short explanation of your project?
The first thing we did is explore the drivers of schistosomiasis in Senegal, and we discovered that villages with more agriculture around them had more schistosomiasis. Through some investigative work, we determined that that was probably a result of fertilizers being more abundant in those villages and higher levels of fertilizer washing off into those water bodies. That then caused the proliferation of submerged aquatic vegetation, which is the habitat for the snails. And we discovered that when we removed this vegetation, there was lower Schistosoma mannsoni infections in school children. In fact, it was up to 46% lower in those villages.
Wow.
So we didn't stop there, though. We knew this worked, but we wanted to convert this public nuisance, this invasive vegetation, into a private good for these communities. And so what we did first is we converted the vegetation into compost and tested it on onion and pepper production and discovered that the benefits were 9 times the costs. When we were pulling out the vegetation, we noticed, quite strikingly, that the livestock across the landscape would start moving towards our piles of vegetation and start munching on it. And so we went ahead and figured, well, let's go ahead and give it a try as livestock feed. And we discovered that it maintained juvenile and adult sheep weight, but was up to 179 times cheaper than the traditional feed. And then we also tested this vegetation as fuel for biodigesters. So we combined it with cow patties, put it in biodigesters, which produce both fertilizer and gas that can be used for cooking or fuel for generators for electricity production. And we discovered we got higher quality gas when we combined the cow patties with this vegetation. And so this is just a giant recycling project. We're returning the nutrients that's coming from the agriculture back to agriculture and converting a public nuisance into a private good, all while reducing infections in these communities and mitigating climate change.
It sounds like an incredible project. Can you tell us a little bit about your first test case that you had? Tell us a bit about the village or where it was, a little bit about why you chose that particular location to start with.
Yeah, we started near Saint Louis proper, which is where our home base is. It's a city in northwestern Senegal. We went to a village called Lampsar, which is just sort of upstream of Saint Louis. We work with this village very closely. We've worked with them for years. They have wonderful community engagement and have been really thrilled about the results and the work that we're doing there. There was one occasion where there were some interested gentlemen. They wanted to know what we were doing. We described our project, and they jumped into the water. They grabbed some rope. They started tying the rope around a very large mat of submerged aquatic vegetation. And then many of these men were pulling on the rope to pull the vegetation into the shoreline and help us remove the vegetation from their water bodies. And it's this sort of response that has gotten us very optimistic.
Do you think this type of approach could be replicated in other areas and at different scales in other parts of Africa or other parts of the world?
Absolutely. We have trials in East Africa and Kenya right now to explore this innovation there. We also have 116 villages in a current cluster randomized clinical trial. And in that scaling approach, we are educating those communities about the public and private benefits of this innovation.
Listening to the project and the details of the project, it strikes me that there are a couple of really important elements that have worked in the favor of how well it's performing. The first of those is exactly what we've talked about on the rest of this episode, moving away from a siloed approach to tackling these sorts of issues. So not only dealing with it as a health problem, but really bringing in a very wide disciplinary focus and a bunch of different expertise. And then the second part that strikes me is really the level of enthusiasm of the participants and really mobilizing that enthusiasm and that passion for the project outcomes and the aims of the project. Would you say that that's a fair assessment?
Absolutely. When we started this project, we made a concerted effort to make sure that it was highly interdisciplinary and that we engaged these communities early on. Just to give you a sense on the various disciplines involved in this work, not only do we have disease biologists, epidemiologists, we have medical doctors providing the drugs to our children and getting urine and fecal samples. We have economists that are able to evaluate the costs and benefits and the cost effectiveness of our innovation. Social scientists delivering household surveys, agronomists to deal with the agricultural trials, veterinary scientists to deal with the sheep involved in those trials. So it's incredibly interdisciplinary, and we could not have accomplished what we have accomplished without that convergent science. Likewise, we couldn't have accomplished what we've accomplished without having the involvement and engagement of these communities early on. We're conducting community-based participatory research. The farmers from these communities are collecting data in our onion and pepper trials. They're participating in our livestock trials. And if it were not for their involvement early, I don't know that we could have identified this innovation, and I don't know that it would have been adopted as it is currently.
Do you think it's fair to say that Nexus approach is helping to break Pharaoh's curse?
Yeah, we're taking a nexus-based, systems-based approach to addressing schisto and thus indirectly addressing Pharaoh's curse.
Rob, that was so ridiculously cool in terms of an example and case study.
Right? This is one of the coolest case study examples that I've come across of anything. It's fantastic that you can actually find an approach and a way of tackling a problem that is so positive across so many different dimensions of human health, food security, energy security, providing new income streams. It really is a tremendous case study.
I think what's also super cool about it was the fact that there are multiple parts of human society participating. So, for example, the project really involved the private sector. And those are things we don't necessarily think about, but are a massive piece of this puzzle.
And really, I think that's what makes the approach so sustainable, the fact that it's not just dependent on government interventions or interventions from charitable organizations. It's finding a way to really create new revenue, new livelihood options for local communities, offering that to businesses in these local communities who are then taking it on and propagating it in a way that is likely to be sustainable.
You know, it's a really great illustration of the opportunities. So it's not just the challenges, not just the trade-offs or the things we're losing, but truly this amazing example of what can be gained. And, you know, thinking back to that musical analogy, we get a symphony of solutions.
That's it for this episode of Nature Insight, Speed Dating with the Future, with me, Rob Spall.
And me, Britt Garner. Next week, we're continuing in the vein of big themes by looking at the IPBES Transformative Change Assessment. This landmark report looks at the underlying causes of biodiversity loss and the kinds of massive changes needed for a more just and sustainable world.
And in the meantime, you can learn more about IPBES's work on www.ipbes.net or on any of our social media channels. Just search for @IPBES. That's @IPBES. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week.